So, really glad you're here today. I'm teaching on Jesus and Islam's that we'll get to here in just a moment. To get you there, well, first of all, I want to say thank you for not only your personal support, but on a broader sense for the church on your financial support. And I'm partly saying this because there are a whole bunch of people who watch us online, and I just want to say this to you, my viewing audience. Your support matters too. So if you love Crosswalk, love us in your offering, because that's the only way we make things happen. And we got amazing things that we think we can do for the community, and the only way we can do that is if we help that along. So you need to know that I support this place financially, and I invite you to do the same too if you believe in who we are and what we're trying to do. We are a unique voice in Napa, to be sure, and we need to keep that voice going loud and strong. So thank you for that. So when I announced that I was going to do this teaching a few weeks ago, I didn't know how things were going to fly. I didn't want to do it during the election process because I didn't want it to seem political, because I try to not be that. We have people from both sides of the aisle in our church, and I love that. That's a good thing to have. And so I believe the polls, like everybody in the United States did, except for Donald Trump this week, and thought I'd be coming in, talking about this more from, how do we think about it from this lens? But because Donald Trump is our president-elect, and because of things that did come out in the election circuit, language that he used about Islam changes how I want to speak about it now. And so I'm not wanting to be political. I'll kind of talk about that later on, about how I'm not being political while at the same time being political. So we'll get to that, but anyway, that'll come later. So first of all, just a little word association. Maybe not for you, but for other people that you know, friends and neighbors, when the words Islam or Muslims comes up, what kind of word associations come with that? Give it to me. Terrorists, yep. Radical, yep. Unbelievers, okay. Immigrants, Abraham. What else? Fear, okay. What else?
Seekers of peace.
Peace, yep, okay, yep. What else? Different. Zahira. Okay, all right. We have a Muslim name. Very good. Okay, yeah. Most of what I heard was definitely on the negative side of things, and I think that's definitely how it is experienced a lot in our culture. I'll tell you a couple stories that inform me as I come in to this whole talk. Two conversations with two different people, both of them gay friends of mine. One was about 8 years ago when Prop 8 didn't pass, and he and his partner, who'd been together for years and years and years, were just kind of devastated because they thought it might happen, and his partner was more devastated than him, and his response to it, to the election, was simply this: it's just information. It's information. It just lets us know where the country is, where our state is. That's how we need to see it. It's just where things are. And as we saw the election go through this week, I thought, we have information. And the information really isn't anything new, is it? Because the same kind of breakdown in terms of who voted for which camp hasn't really changed that much for the last several elections, really. The difference is we see it more clearly now. And we can't hide away from it now. And whereas before there was a greater sensitivity to language that was used, partly because Barack Obama is black and he experienced a lot of the ugliness of language that he himself as a person causes people to speak differently. That changed a lot. And so we see a tonal change in even how things are being protested now. I'll be speaking a lot to that later. But the other thing, and this gets to kind of your responses when I asked you what people say when you say the word Islam or Muslim, is my other friend, who also happens to be gay, and that's informative because 8 years ago, I was having a conversation with him, and for many years before that, about the kind of experience he had in our country, particularly from the church, who really treated him as less than human because he was gay. and did not treat him with respect or grace or dignity whatsoever. And in many ways, just the opposite, where from the church of Jesus Christ, he experienced the exact opposite of grace. He experienced hatred and wanted to be kept out. And that did its work on him. Because he wants nothing to do with the church or religion at all. He's not quite sure what to do with me. He knows I'm a pastor. I love the guy. We have a good relationship. We're friends. We've been friends for a long time. He knows I respect him. He knows where I am on this particular issue, which is, I believe in equality. So that's there. But what fascinates me, and why I told you that backstory, is last June, we're having a garage sale. And we're trying to sell all of our junk, right? And we're getting toward the end of the garage sale. And you need to know that the very next day, my family is leaving on a whopper trip, meandering our way through national parks to land in Kansas City for a family wedding. And then Lakin and I are going to fly out for Africa to see Faraha and all that stuff. Huge trip. So we have a lot on our plate. And my friend comes over and we start having a political discussion. And he starts telling me how he's decided he wants to vote for Trump. And I'm thinking to myself, what? What? And so we started this conversation, and actually it was a pretty embroiled dialogue, and the gist of it was this. He's terrified of Muslims. Terrified. He's read some stuff which suggests that there is absolutely nothing peaceful about them. That as the entire religion needs to be wiped off the planet. This is kind of the way he's thinking. And what was so shocking to me, and I shared this with him directly, I said, dude, I'm just kind of wigging out here because you were on the other side of this not very long ago and still struggling, with societal acceptance and all this kind of a thing. And yet I'm kind of seeing the same rhetoric about an entire other people group being painted with a very broad brush. I don't get it. And anyway, that just kind of blew my mind. But what it told me was there's a lot of very strong feeling about Islam. So my goal today is to give you a very general overview of the religion, tell you what it is, tell you what it is not, and then ask the question, like I'm doing here, kind of a what would Jesus do kind of a thing. What would a Jesus approach be? Because we have this little tagline here at the church, walk with God, walk with others, and... Right, it's kind of our mantra. And if there's one that's most important over all the others, it's that last one. Because the last one forces the other two in line. So this whole Jesus thing matters a lot. When I taught on homosexuality, I called it Jesus and homosexuality. Because that's really our lens for thinking through everything. Through God, theology, our ethics, everything. So that's where I want to go with. And on the next slide, I would highly recommend this book. Actually, it was recommended this from one of my son's professors. My son is a student down at Pepperdine, and he's taking a world religion course, and great professor. And so he was telling me about what he was learning. He says, hey, ask this guy, what's a good resource, just something to have. And so he recommended this, and so I bought it. And I got to tell you, when I read the introduction, I hated it because it challenged my position in a way that I didn't want to be challenged. And so that leads me to tell you my bias up front. The only people who would think that I'm a super conservative guy are people who haven't been paying any attention at all for a long time. So my biases I'll talk about at the end of my talk today is I really resonate with a couple different ways of thinking about God in total. I've shifted a lot away from a personification way of God, which is a very humanizing way to think about God. And I've kind of shifted into a very intimate God, but beyond our description. And as soon as we think we've defined God, we've already said we're sunk, because you can't, because God is too big for that. And shifting now into, and these are not new ideas, these are centuries old, but now more into a ground of being idea. That God is our ground of being for everything, for life. You cannot live apart from God. It's impossible to, whether you like it or not, because God is just that present everywhere in all of creation. And so I really resonate with that, and that led me to kind of an idea of, hey, let's just get along. We're all trying to figure out the same thing, so let's just get over that and give each other a big group hug, sing Kumbaya, and go for world peace. That would work. And this introduction challenged that. And I didn't like that, but I'll explain why I agree with him toward the end. And for those of you who are like, what? Just hold on, because I think it'll make sense. All right, so let's jump right into Islam. This is a very cursory overview of it. This is just information, and I'm trying to be pretty unbiased, just give it to you straight. So Islam literally means submission, or surrender. Muslims are people who are practicing the religion of Islam, which makes them submissioners or surrenderers, people of submission. That's why when they go to the masjid or the mosque, that's why they bow down the way they do in prayer. It is an act, if you think about it, actually I think we Christians could probably benefit a lot from it. If we actually did their same body kind of prayer where they bow down literally in prayer and say, Allahu Akbar, God is great, that's what that means. That's how they start every prayer. Say it 3 times in a row. God is great, God is great, God is great. And that's what they're saying as they're praying. That's how they begin. There are even some that get a mark on their forehead because they pray so much. There's a particular branch within Islam that uses a particular stone, and they get a mark from that stone on their forehead, and it shows their piety. I think there's something we can learn from Islam about their commitment to prayer. At the very bottom of the screen, Islam was started by a guy named Muhammad. And he had a spiritual experience while he lived in and around Mecca. Mecca is in Saudi Arabia today. So he had this experience where he sensed God calling him to come listen, that he was going to tell him something. He was going to recite something to him. Those recitations over a 22-year period became what we call the Quran. Quran means recitations. So that's what we're working with here. You need to understand that Muhammad lived in a pluralistic environment, that the government of the day in Mecca believed in a multiplicity of gods, probably warring with each other and not really caring a lot about people, as was the case in a lot of other pockets in the world. And the primary first message that Muhammad walked away from in this experience that he had was that God is not many, but that God is one. Just one. So there was a lot of agreement with Judaism at that point. In fact, they both go back, Judaism and Islam go back to Abraham. The story changes. The way they understand the story changes. So for you and I, and the Christian and Jewish tradition, when we read the story of Abraham and Isaac, for instance, and Isaac is sacrificed or almost sacrificed, and God stops it just in the nick of time to say, no more of this. For Islam, that character changes to Ishmael, which is fascinating. So it shifts in that stuff. You need to know, too, that the Quran was not put down to actual pen and paper until about 20 years after Muhammad died. So that's kind of similar to our New Testament, and actually dissimilar to our Old Testament, because our Old Testament wasn't actually written down for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, at least the Pentateuch anyway. And so you have a shift there where you have an oral tradition happening in 622-ish CE. That's what's taking place. Hadith is a collection of writings that Muhammad put together that help unpack the Quran. It answers the question, okay, so we have these recitations, how do we apply them? And the Hadith answers that question. So ideas about government, law, all that stuff comes from the Hadith. It is second to the Quran, but Quran is considered absolutely holy. Here's just a point of distinction here that I think is really helpful. Because the Quran is believed to have been a recitation directly from the mouth of God in Arabic, they believe that that is the revelation of God. And the only version of the Quran that counts and is holy is the Arabic account. So you can get an app. I have an app on here of the Quran in English. I've read the whole Quran, by the way, so you need to know that. It sounds really impressive until you realize it's the size of our New Testament. So it's not that big. It doesn't really take that long to get through. And It's interesting to read it because, you know, it's a pretty big deal. It's the second largest religion in the world, kind of helpful to know it. It'd be worth you reading. But know that that English version you're reading isn't really the holy one. Because the only one that's holy in their religion and their system and thinking is the one in Arabic. It's also interesting to know on that revelation side, this is very important for you to understand, is that in Christianity everything hinges on Jesus. So we believe that the revelation of God ultimately in the Christian tradition is through Jesus. So depending on how you work out the incarnation thing, either, you know, born a demigod, so to speak, which is certainly the Orthodox way, or was so infused with the power of God by the time he was baptized or through baptism or whatever. But either way, you end up with a Jesus who is the revelation of God. And so when we think about Jesus, what he says, what he does, we see God with hands and feet. Okay? That's where you need to see a distinction. Because sometimes we think that we need to look at Jesus and Muhammad as the central figures to compare. No, that's not it. You need to compare Jesus with the Quran. Because they believe the Quran was the revelation. And you need to compare Muhammad with the Bible. Does that make any sense? Because at least the way we think about it here, at least the way I teach it, is the Bible has a whole lot of human fingerprints on it. That doesn't mean that God was not involved in the process. I'm sure that happened. But there's a whole lot of human influence and worldview and all that stuff there. So even though there are some churches that say, well, the Bible is holy just like the Quran and every word, there are massive holes in that position. And they've all been worked out in big important committees somewhere that make sort of reasonable ways to think that through. But I don't really look at it that way. So anyway, I'm kind of getting off on a tangent. But what I want you to hear is, as Jesus is to the Quran, Muhammad is to the Bible. So we need to not compare Jesus and Muhammad because they're two different animals. In fact, the reason why I wanted you to talk about, or wanted to have you say David is the most beloved king of Israel, is if I were to think about a parallel for Muhammad, it'd be King David. Because David ran the show. And he certainly shifted the way people thought about faith by the way he lived. A man after God's own heart, who is Israel's most beloved king. So in my blog, which you can read this afternoon, I talk about some of the attributes that are used to describe Muhammad from the Islam tradition. And they're glorious. I mean, they're really, really generous. Well, what would you expect? Because he's their King David. So think about it that way. Ramadan is a holiday, a period of time that celebrates the giving of the Quran, or the recitation. Islam began officially in 622 Common Era, CE. And it began, that's actually when the clock starts clicking or ticking for Islam. So year zero is 622 in their calendar, using that religious kind of a calendar. And that was the time when Muhammad and his followers had to get out of Mecca and flee to Medina for their lives because they were going to get the tar beat out of them. And they made it to Medina and started things all over again. By the end of the day, or the end of Muhammad's life, he became a ruler over, not just his little group of people, but really it was becoming a superpower at that point in the ancient era. And it was as bloody and ruthless as anything in the Old Testament that you would see. And you need to keep that in mind, because you're talking about a different time in history where they thought about war differently, they thought about life differently, they thought about God differently, and it was all very, very bloody. So I think about that too. I think about Muhammad as a ruler, I think about David as a ruler. Both are incredibly bloody. So bear that in mind when you think about that. So 622 is when it started. Muhammad died in around 632, and that's about the time the last recitation came for him. Muhammad is said to be illiterate, meaning he didn't write down any of the recitations, but apparently people were around him to listen to it, and they remembered it and got that written down eventually. Out of Islam, after Muhammad died, there was a split in the religion, and the major split went either left or right from the Sunnis and the Shias. The Sunnis, who are the vast majority of Islam adherents in the world, they believe in tradition. And they also believe that it's meant to be a community approach to thinking about the faith and how we interpret the Quran, and even how they apply the Hadith, which is the interpretation of the Quran in terms of how you actually live your life and stuff like that. The Shia, on the other hand, are much more fundamental in their approach. And they are believing kind of like the Pope has a direct line, or at least used to, all the way back to Peter. They believe that the real voice of Islam comes from the Caliph, who is the voice of God at this point. Shia is the tribe or the sect within Islam that no doubt gives birth to more of the terrorist variety, especially ISIS. So that's where it's coming from. But Shia is a very small, comparatively small part of the overall Islam faith. The Sufis, I love the Sufis. Sufis are awesome. Sufis are mystics. When Richard Rohr talks about how the deepest adherents, the deepest followers of all faith traditions discover that God, this ground of being, is loving and lovely in every way, that's a Sufi perspective. How many of you have read any of Rumi's poetry? Yeah, you should. You totally should. It'll do your heart good. It will expand God's beauty for you. And the good news is you can get it for free. So just look it up online and read some of his stuff. Because when you read some of Rumi's stuff, you're going to be like, wow, this guy found out from an Islamic tradition that God is absolutely loving and beautiful. And he couldn't stop talking about it. So I dare you to read one, see how that goes for you. I think it's good. So that's a little bit about the background of the religion. We still got some more stuff to go through here. Let me get to that, the Shahada, the profession of faith. These things there, you kind of see where I am, about 2/3 way down. So we got 5 different things here. These are the 5 pillars of the Muslim faith that they're after. The first thing is the profession of faith. That's the most important pillar. And you can become a Muslim by agreeing to 2 things. One, that God is one, and that God is great. And the second thing is that Muhammad is his prophet. That's what they're looking for. There's your confession of faith, ultimately. Beyond that, the other 4 pillars help hold up the whole thing. So they have the Salat, which is prayer. There are 5 calls to prayer throughout the day, which actually I think is a really cool thing. The prayers are offered. They're not Christian or evangelical Protestant prayers. Especially in our tradition, if you've grown up in like an Anglican tradition or a Presbyterian tradition, and you come to our church, you're like, what world are we living in? Because the only prayer we're hearing is the one Pete's making up on the fly. How can that be any good? Well, that is a good question. However, you need to know that is a Protestant way of thinking. That we have this idea, because of our way of thinking about Jesus, that God is extremely personal, and so we just pray as we want, like Jesus, our good buddy, would want us to. And there's a great beauty in that. But that's not how they pray. The prayers that you see at called times of prayers are usually offered in Arabic. Another thing that might be helpful for you to know is only about 20% of the people who call Islam their faith know Arabic. So, as this author pointed out, it's like their relationship, it's more of finding themselves in the rhythm or the tone of prayer, even though they might not know exactly the content of the prayer. It's like there's a song in the heart that they resonate with. Does that make sense? More than the written thing. In fact, there's even a label, I can't remember the name of it right now, but for young kids, boys and girls, that learn it by rote. They might not know what they're saying, but they're singing the prayers. And if they do that, they kind of get a little merit badge of sorts and are recognized for their hard work at memorizing these prayers. And it's more of a sing-song in the flow kind of a thing. And they know that God has great parts there and some other pieces as well. But the general prayer, which you can find in this book or online, it's a pretty peaceful prayer. It's not ugly. It's distinct to their religion for sure. The zakat, which has to do with charity, a little different than Christianity and Judaism. Christianity really beats the drum on 10%. It's called the tithe, and we encourage people to give 10% of their income back to the work of the kingdom. It's a little different in their rendering. It's 2.5%, which may be cause enough for many of you to jump ship even today. But it's a different rendering. So it's on your total value. So every year you're looking at your worth, apart from, say, your house, because you can't really cash out your house that way. But and in terms of your actual assets, you're giving away 2% every year. That's quite a lot. And you're giving it directly to the poor. So that's how that works out. It's part of their whole thing. Fasting is a part of their being faithful. And Ramadan, that whole period of time, you fast every day. You can break the fast early in the morning or at night, but as long as the sun's out, you're not eating. And I think that's a good practice. Fasting is a good thing. It helps us have clarity. And the final thing is the pilgrimage, the Hajj. And this is a call for every Muslim to make their way back to Mecca to recognize where this whole thing began. So those are the 5 pillars. There are some buzzwords that are pretty helpful for you to get some clarity on. Jihad is one of those. The literal meaning of jihad is struggle. Struggle. There's another word that we are familiar with in the Jewish tradition, and by extension the Christian tradition, that also means struggle. You know what that word is? Israel. Israel means struggle. Jacob, before he was going to have his meeting with his brother, who he basically swindled out of a deal, Esau, he was going to meet him the next day, and all night long he couldn't sleep. And so what does he do? He wrestles with this angel, this messenger of God, all night. And when they wake up, he's still alive, meaning he's got fight in the game. He wants to go through with this thing. He doesn't want to die. And he forces the angel to bless him. And the angel says, all right, well, first I'm going to just give you this little limp in your hip. So he did something to his hip. And then he says, I'm going to give you a new name. And your name is Israel. Struggles with God. That's what it means. Jihad, for most Muslims, talks about more of a spiritual struggle. But there are verses in the Quran that say sometimes the jihad is physical, requiring military. So you have both. But don't be surprised or shocked if you go around the Bay Area and sometimes you'll see a sign, up on like a billboard, and it'll say, I don't know, addiction is my jihad, or hard work is my jihad, or whatever it is, or education is my jihad. And what they're referring to there is, this is my goal, this is what I'm putting my passion into. Most Muslims in the world, when we think about jihad as a holy war type thing, including the most academic Muslims in the world who are trying to teach people from the highest levels down, when they see terrorism happen, or when they see jihad called for as a holy war against people, they are renounced. So when bin Laden was doing his thing from Spain, one of an ancient schools of Islam, they came forward with a very quick statement that any form of terrorism like that is apostate. It's heresy. And you need to know that. And they'll be quick to point out that there are verses in the Quran that completely denounce suicide. And there are verses in the Quran that completely denounce killing the innocents, women and children. So anytime we see the Quran being used as a thing of violence, that's a problem. And it should be a problem within Islam. Another question that we sometimes have has to do with Sharia. And you hear the phrase a lot, Sharia law. The word Sharia actually means law. So when you see Sharia law, it just simply means law. law, right? But not really a tone. So Sharia simply has to do with law. In the United States, we have separation of church and state. That's how we think on our soil. Started that way. That's the way we wanted it. We had a lot of religious people coming to this new land because they wanted that kind of freedom. They'd had the government telling them what to do and how to believe, and they'd lost a lot of loved ones because of that, including our Baptist tradition. So know that one of the largest and strongest voices that still today his voice communicates a lot of evangelical theology. His name was John Calvin. You need to remember this, that John Calvin, when he tried to set up his own little world where there was no separation of church and state, he was zero tolerance on people's faithlessness or disagreement with him. And he called for the death of many Christians who just simply didn't understand Christianity his way. So that's what it looks like when there's no separation of church and state. So you got these new folks that come over here. That's part of our DNA, and that's a very good thing. But in Islam, that's not how it works. In fact, Muhammad, who was at least a vehicle for the Quran and wrote the Hadith, or at least talked about it, it's a whole system. It's a system of faith, it's a system of government, it's a system of how you do everything. In fact, there was a book that was written some years ago, it's referred to in this other book that I mentioned, that talked about the 100 most influential people in world history. Number one on the list is Muhammad. And the reason he was at the top of the list, according to the author, is, well, Jesus was number 2, and Paul was somewhere down the list, number 4 or 5, the Apostle Paul, who gave us 2/3 of the New Testament. But the author said, you know, what it took Jesus and Paul to do together collectively, here's the core of the faith, this is how we work it out. Muhammad did it all on his own. And he was a ruler, and he did all this and that. And so that's why they put him at the most influential person in world history. And, you know, several billion people follow his faith tradition. So there's that. But he did not believe in separation of church and state. And that means that we're dealing with a whole different worldview, doesn't it? Sharia law, interestingly, because that is the type of law that is respected within the Islam community, sometimes Sharia law courts are set up in strange places. Like, did you know Israel has set up Sharia law courts as a way to help Muslims figure out their own legal issues, because that's the law that they will respect. Just very different way of thinking. Let's talk about 2 more questions up here. First of all, when I ask the question, where is Islam? I know it's everywhere around the world, but if you were to say where the greatest concentration, the greatest population of Muslims are, what would you say?
India.
I'll give you the top 10. The number 1 on the list, Indonesia. Number 2 on the list, India. Number 3 on the list, Pakistan. Number 4 on the list, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, it'll come to me in a second. Number 5 on the list is Egypt. Number 6 on the list is Iran. Number 7 on the list is Morocco. Number 8 on the list is Algeria. Number 9 on the list is Nigeria. And number 10 on the list is Turkey. Indonesia has so many Muslims. They have 3 times the number of Muslims in Indonesia than Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan combined. So we need to think about a different picture when we think about Muslims. We immediately go to Middle East because that's where it started. And that's just not expressive of the whole thing. This next question here, this is really what the author of God Is Not One is getting at. He asked the question, what problem is Islam Islam identifying to solve? At the core of Islam theology, the number 1 thing they're trying to solve is human self-sufficiency or pride. They see pride as the number 1 issue. That's why Islam means submission. It's submission to God, submission to the way of God is the answer to the world's problems. It shares some of this in terms of its focus on law with Judaism. Judaism is the people of the book, the people of the law. That's what they're known for. You need to know that this purpose of trying to help people with self-sufficiency and lose pride and walk in submission to God, that is a different goal than Christianity. Now, I don't agree with where Christianity has become since about 300-ish CE, because I have some real problems with that. But if you were just to do a casual reading without much historical reflection or insight on the New Testament, One quick thing you could say is about what Christianity is about is salvation. That the goal of Christianity is salvation, to get saved. And to unpack that a little bit, to go to the next layer, well, saved from what? Saved from sin. Sin where? Original sin. Because we're all sinners, and God is holy, and something's got to be done to solve that equation. And so that's what Christianity is all about, to answer that problem of original sin so that we can go to heaven someday. Now, that's an oversimplification, but that is the faith that many people believe is Christianity, salvation. You have two very different goals here. You have one that is about submission by following the ways of God and following the law, which, by the way, is a much more Jewish way of thinking. And then you've got this one over here, Christianity, which is about getting your soul saved, getting your original sin canceled. Islam and Judaism both do not believe in the doctrine of original sin. And so for them, the concept of original sin is a non-issue, because for them, it isn't there. That's a Christian overlay on things. That's a sermon for another day. But that goal about what each religion is after is so important, because you cannot compare them. You cannot try to say that they are the same thing. So on the next slide, did I cover everything there? Yeah, I think I did. I want to talk about backgammon, baseball, and elephants. First, backgammon and baseball. So I asked you, how many people think basketball is the better sport over football? How many people think football is the better sport? Oh, such true Americans, right? The new pastime. If I were to ask you, out of all the sports that you can think of, baseball, basketball, tennis, football, whatever, if I asked you which sport is best at scoring runs, which sport would I be talking about? Baseball. In fact, you know that you're not talking to much of a sports fan if they ask you about the Giants game and say, how many points did the Giants get? Because you know it's not true. Something's wrong. Or if after you come back tonight, and I don't know who's playing who today, I don't follow football as much as I follow baseball and basketball, but you know, if you come back tonight and somebody asks you, so how many runs did the Niners get? They're like, okay, this guy's a great baseball fan, knows nothing about football, apparently, right? Baseball is a sport. Basketball is a sport. Football is a sport. Backgammon is a game that came out of Saudi Arabia. So that's why I put it up there. So if you really want to stretch it, it's a sport. But you really can't compare baseball and basketball, can you? They're both games. They're both sport. But the rules, the way you think about each game, are radically different. That's a very helpful analogy for me that came out of that book I recommended. We're talking about two different things. We're talking about apples and oranges. They're answering different questions. They're going after different kinds of things. Now, in my hopes, I like the ground of being idea about thinking about God, because it gives me this hope that, you know, if we all just drill down enough and study enough, we're going to find out that our ground of being is God and grace and love and all this, and that's a beautiful, wonderful thing. And I still believe that. I believe that at the core, that is what's going on, because that's who I've discovered God to be. That's who I've discovered other people, even of other traditions, that's who God is, that God is truly loving and forgiving. And by the way, the Quran articulates the forgiveness of God. So it's not about killing people, you know, earned your right, but there are very clear statements within the Quran that simply say, if you ask for forgiveness, you've got it. So there are elements of and expressions of both all over the place. In fact, there's a story, sort of a parable about elephants. Comes out of India. I don't know if it's specifically Buddhist, but it might as well be. And the story goes like this. You got these blind guys that approach an elephant. And they all go touching different parts of the elephant, and they're asked to describe, what are you feeling? And one blind guy feels the tail, and he's like, well, this thing's a rope. And of course it's a rope. And another guy's feeling the trunk. He says, no, it's a big hose of some kind. That's what it is. And another guy feels the ear, and it's flapping around. He says, oh, no, we're feeling a fan here. That's what's going on. And another guy's feeling the body of the elephant, and he's like, oh, this thing is a canvas. That's what this thing is. And another guy's feeling a tusk. He says, no, we're talking about a spear here. That's what this thing is. And the idea of it is simply this, that in terms of thinking about world religions, this has been an analogy used to say this is how it is. That we're all trying to describe the very same thing. We just can't see it because we don't have the right vantage point. Or sometimes the idea of ascending a mountain is the same thing. Like each religion is trying to work its way up the mountain to get the vista of God, to get closer to God. And that's a beautiful analogy. But let me ask you this. Could there be a problem in terms of getting along if the only part of the elephant that one person feels is the tusk or the spear, and the other person is feeling the ear, which is just this gentle fan? Now, sure, they may be talking about an elephant, but in real time right now, you got two very different things. You got two very different agendas and realities and understandings of everything and how that plays out. And what if, on the mountain analogy, yeah, okay, we're all climbing the same mountain, but what if we're climbing different mountains to ascend different heights? We're going to see different things depending on what part of the globe you're in. And so kind of what I'm getting at from this recommended book, make sure I get his name right, Prothero, is to kind of have a wizened up hopefulness. And this is what it means for me. Because I really do still believe that the ground of being is God, and that God that I've discovered and so many others have is lovely. But we don't live in that world all the time, and not everybody's there. And that changes the game some. It doesn't change it altogether, but it changes it some. And I know this game is real because I've experienced it just within Christianity. You may have heard this, but now and then I've had a provocative message or two that has gotten me in trouble. Sometimes with you, not much. But definitely with other pastors who have flat out written me off as a heretic. I'm no longer one of the guys, even though I used to be one of the leaders of the guys. When I show up to a pastor meeting at a luncheon, silence comes in the room. That's just the way it is. Now, I can talk to these guys, my colleagues, and I respect them, and some days like them, love them, doesn't mean I have to like them, but anyway, I can talk till I'm blue in the face that, at the end of the day, I'm trying to follow Jesus, and I'm just interpreting some things differently than they are. But that doesn't make us enjoy our pizza anymore. And it doesn't make me any safer to them. In fact, it actually confirms that I'm the devil that they thought I was. Because now I'm just trying to spin a new lie. And to be honest, I have the same bias going the other way. That's the reality that we live in. So there's this tension that we have of, at least for me, this hopefulness that, yep, all religions everywhere, they are trying to figure out how to make sense of everything. They're trying to make sense of how to figure out life. How do we do this thing? How do we get through it in a good way? And how do we understand the divine, which seems to be so everywhere? So I love that. We're all trying to do that, and yet at the same time, we are people living in history that are marching forward in time and history, and we're not all seeing things the same place, the same way. Some of us are feeling tusks that feel like spears, and others of us are trying to draw on a canvas, and they're just two very different things. There is a tension there that exists that has to be dealt with. So what do we do with it? Well, I think there are two counterproductive responses. One is the complete naivety, which is, we just need to all get along, because I don't think that's realistic. And part of the stats bear that out. In most of the world, there are parts of the world where, you might see 40% of Muslims believe that suicide bombing is an appropriate means toward justice. So that's the game that's there. In the Middle Eastern countries, that number rises to 70%. That's a very different way to think about things. But it's data. But most of the world's Muslims, remember, Indonesia has 3 times as many as 3 big countries that we thought had so many. And most of the world's Muslims do not live in the Middle East. Most of them live outside the Middle East. And most of those people worldwide do not see suicide bombings as an appropriate means to move forward through justice. That's helpful information. My naivety has to recognize that is the dynamic that we have. That's real. And yet the other side, if naivety and just say, let's just get along and sing Kumbaya, if that's one end of the perspective, the other end of this perspective is equally naive and dangerous. And I would say even more dangerous because it pokes the bear. And that is to take a fundamentalist approach against fundamentalists. Because a fundamentalist approach or orientation toward religion says very clearly, I am right. God is with me, and if you don't agree with me, you are wrong. God is not with you, and I don't give a rip about you. I had a meeting a few weeks ago, and somebody asked a board member, how do we understand Calvinism? And this is an oversimplification. but the response that came out of this brilliant mouth was, Calvinism means God loves some. And that's about right. In extreme, anyway. Well, fundamentalism has that same kind of attitude. I'm right, you're wrong, so I don't really care what happens to you unless you bow the knee. By the way, I am not a Christian according to fundamentalists because I have completely disagreed from one or two or more of its 5 tenets, its 5 pillars or whatever. So by fundamentalists, I'm already toast. They don't really care what happens to me, and they feel sorry for all of you idiots that are following me. Right? I don't think you're idiots. I think you're wonderful, and we agree with each other. But anyway, that's a different thing. So I think that kind of brash, let's just do it, I think that probably does more harm, and it doesn't help. So then it raises the question, well, what influenced Jesus, and how did he think about it? In ancient Israel, Jesus was influenced. He lives in the north part of the country. If ancient Israel was America, Jesus would be Midwest, or maybe Bible Belt. Regular, ordinary folk who are just getting along, doing life. Meanwhile, the cities in San Francisco, L.A., New York, Houston, whatever, they're running everything amok. And the people in the Midwest can't figure out what's the problem with these people on the coast. They just keep making stupid decisions. And the people on the coast are like, where's Kansas again? That's one of those flyover states, isn't it? Right? And that's kind of the attitude with that. So Jesus lived in one of the flyover states in ancient Israel. And he had influences around him. He knew about the Sadducees who were running the show in Jerusalem, who were more interested in keeping their wealth and keeping peace with Rome. He knew very well the Pharisees, which is another theological tradition that was definitely strong in Jesus' neck of the woods. They were a little bit more homegrown, more centrist, more spiritual, and they influenced the way most Jewish people thought in Jesus' world. Then you had Zealots. Zealots were the revolutionaries. They just can't wait until the one comes that's going to lead the charge, and we're going to wipe Rome off the planet because God is with us, and it's going to be great. Get your pitchfork, right? That's kind of their idea. And some people have suggested that Jesus was, in fact, a zealot. And then you have the Essenes, who we know them well because they gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran. The Essenes are like the Amish. All you people are doing the faith wrong. We're just going to tuck away, and we're going to practice it in some kind of a pure way. Now, I'm oversimplifying, but these are the voices that are there, and these are the voices that are shaping Jesus' worldview. Also remember, Jesus is a guy who's lived his whole life almost squashed like a bug. So he knows what it's like to be treated poorly because of his occupation. He did not command much respect for being a carpenter. You're going to see an auction item or two up here by artisans. One of them, Peyton put together this gorgeous table that he made from scraps in his shops. Gorgeous. And you think, man, that's carpentry. That's gorgeous. That commands respect everywhere. Or you see some of Lauren's work. In fact, Lauren's got a very cool camping box that my wife says I cannot bid on. But it is super cool. And I want it really bad. So I'm looking at this thing and I think, man, that is craftsmanship from a real, true, deformed carpenter. So I have high respect for that. Not in Jesus' day. It's an agrarian culture. So he knew what it was like to be looked down on from his culture. He lived in a redneck area around Galilee. He knew what it would look like to be looked down the nose on in terms of his intellect. You remember one of the stories where somebody was talking about him? Where's this guy coming from? And somebody says, oh, he's coming from Nazareth. And the people who were there listening to this thing, I think they were in Jerusalem, they were like, Nazareth? Does anything good come from Nazareth? That's their attitude. So Jesus is full aware of all that. And so you might wonder, when Jesus is faced with people the Jewish people hate, can't stand, that when you mention just their religious tradition, people come up with all kinds of things like unbeliever, apostate, terrorists, against us, from Satan, all this stuff. That people group was the Samaritans, by the way, and Jesus referred to them and interacted with them a number of times. You've heard of the parable of the Good Samaritan, right? It's one of the most famous parables Jesus taught. It was shocking because the Samaritan was the hero of the story, while the Jewish leaders who knew better walked right by the guy who was left for dead. And the real shock of the story was that the Samaritan was good. Jesus mixes it up with a woman at a well in Samaria. So she's got double foul, triple foul. Actually, she's a woman. Jesus is on the rabbinical side, shouldn't be talking to her anyway, but he strikes up a conversation. Finds out, or he already knew, that she was a woman with some baggage. And so he shouldn't have been talking to her because he might soil his reputation. And, of course, they're in Samaria, the hated Islam of their day. How does Jesus react to her? Treats her with dignity, grace, respect. She tries to pick a fight. Jesus smooths it over. Jesus redirects. Jesus offers hope and grace. It's another weird story, a little obscure, where Jesus is up in the North Country, and this woman is asking for some healing for her kid. And Jesus recognized, you're a Gentile. It even kind of has this weird exchange, makes Jesus look like a jerk. Maybe he kind of was at that point in time, we're not sure. But anyway, the woman says, or Jesus says, should I be sharing any food with you? I'm a Jew, you're not. And the woman says, well, even dogs get crumbs off the table. And Jesus plays along and says, well done. And the healing comes. There's another point where Jesus goes across the lake from his home, goes into enemy territory. So we're no longer in Jewish lands, but we're in this other area. And they get off the boat and they find themselves near a cemetery. And there's this guy that has some serious mental issues that's running around naked in the cemetery. Generally, a guy running around naked in the cemetery lets you know there might be some issues there. So that's exactly what they found. The whole town was freaking out about this guy because they couldn't control him, they couldn't wrestle him down, they couldn't keep him down, couldn't get him well and all this stuff. Serious problems. And it's a very funny story because he sends the demons or whatever was going on into a herd of pigs, which Jews don't like either. They all die running off a cliff, and you're dealt with this guy who's all healed up. The point of it is, here you have an extremely aggressive guy from another religious and cultural tradition who you'd think Peter would have just brought out his sword and taken care of business. And maybe he did have his sword pulled. But the point is that that's not how Jesus treated him. He recognized where he was at, but he offered healing and hope. And, one of the final ones that you can't miss throughout, moving forward from Jesus. I mean, he was the guy even hanging on the cross. Now he's being killed by the Jewish leadership who were acting in a very zealous manner. And what does Jesus say to them as they're doing this to him? Father, forgive them. I don't know what the heck they're doing. They just don't know. He could have done something different, but he didn't. So he didn't do this. He talks strong. You want to see Jesus uncork it. I think I gave you a link in my blog. It's like around Matthew 23 or so. You want to see Jesus pull the gloves off? Look at that. But remember who he's talking to. He's talking to his own religious contemporaries who are being jerks toward everybody else. I even did a sermon reminded me of that this summer called More Jesus, Less Jerk. Remember that one? Wasn't it wonderful? The truth still holds. You got Jesus, what are you going to do? If you're going to be a Jesus follower, it means you're going to be less jerk, more Jesus. Less jerk, more Jesus. The disciples figured that out, by the way. Sam gave us a teaching a few weeks ago about Philip, who finds this Ethiopian eunuch who's trying to find God, but there are a whole lot of reasons why Philip could have just walked away or looked the other way, but he didn't. He offered inclusion to this guy. Later on, Peter has this vision from God and a voice of God saying, hey, there's going to be this guy that comes, they're going to send messages of you, go with this guy. And so Peter goes, finds himself surrounded by a double enemy, one, a Gentile, and two, a Cornelius, who is a commander in the Roman army. And he kind of klutzes his way through this preaching moment, but at the end of the day, recognizing that God was with them and working on them, invited them to be followers along with him. He got in trouble from his own authority figures later on, but he knew that was what he needed to do. Paul, his whole life, most of his writing is to non-Jewish places in ancient Mesopotamia. So the whole MO for this movement was grace and peace. You know why they had to do that? Because they weren't in power. They weren't in power. They were the underdog for the first 300 years of the movement. You know what happened when that changed? We changed. We became the religion of the superpower, and we forgot what it was to follow Jesus. And we started using rhetoric of hatred, coercion, threat, because we could. So how do we get along? This is where I'm going to try not to be political and be political all at the same time. We have a tension. We have a tension between our highest hopes and ideals of what we really think people are trying to do with religion in the first place, and yet we live in a very temporal time, where we live in a time in history where not everybody's going to see it the same way, and some of those people are going to just be unbelievably violent in their distortion of their own scriptural texts. So we live in this tension. How do we live in this tension? And the answer is Jesus. The answer is Jesus. And I want to tell you, there were probably a whole lot of reasons why people voted the way they voted last Tuesday for either candidate. And neither candidate was Polly Purewhite or whatever, whatever a male version of that would be. Neither one. Both came with baggage. But maybe you didn't care about the candidates because you're more interested in the political ideology. Some of you resonate more with the Republican platform than you do the Democratic platform. Or maybe you are worried more about future legal decisions, and so you kind of like where Republicans might take it with the Supreme Court more than the Democrats, and you didn't really care about the people on top. But the fact is that Donald Trump is our president-elect. And the fact is that the way he used his mouth during the whole election process in no way reflected Jesus. In no way reflected Jesus. So I'm asked you to do two things as your pastor who doesn't want to be political. As just because if you voted for him or if you didn't vote for him, the truth of the matter is not every person is 100% of one thing. Meaning you can disagree and even protest one aspect of something that you see while being kind of okayish with the other. Does that make sense? It means that if you see hate speak, and there has been hate speak, there's been language that is not reflective of Jesus in tone or content, and does not reflect the roots of our country, that need to be voiced out against. Because I don't see that in Jesus. And we can talk about immigration reform, we can talk about how we're going to deal with terrorism, without using language that is going to demean, defame, or dehumanize the people who are involved in those things we're talking about. You understand? I think that is the way we go forward in tension. I don't have the answers. I'm just a pastor. But I do know that if we go one or both of those extremes, that's not reflecting Jesus. Jesus knew his audience. He chose to act gracefully everywhere he went. When we see disgrace as Jesus followers, you can still be a Republican, you can still, if you voted Trump, you can still be a Republican, you can still be hopeful for the things that Trump wanted to do in terms of cleaning up and accountability and all that, but you don't have to be okay with language that kills. You have the choice on that. And as Jesus followers, we have the choice about who we want to follow. And the Jesus that I see in response to this In the response to his Islam of the day, which was Samaritans, he acted with dignity and grace. So, back to David. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. If it was a song, it might sound like this, like my mother told me. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord. You know when we would sing that? We'd sing it in choir every Sunday, right around the prayer time. May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord. And then we'd end it with an amen, what I'll get to. Because the amen simply means so be it. Let it be so. You think you can sing the tune with me? May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord. Do you think you can actually pray that song? May the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord. Amen. Amen. Amen.